Good evening. Pardon me for using notes, but I'm sharing something personal, and even though I may not look to them, it helps me feel confident that they're there. Mommy, wake up, wake up, wake up. I was still half asleep and I could hear the students outside our window and telling us to please hurry up, come on, wake up. And they said the soldiers have taken over the country. And, half asleep, I put on my robe and I went to turn on the light switch, and then I remembered I was in West Africa. There was no electricity until 5 a.m. So I told the students, come around to the door, and they came around, we let them in, we turned on our shortwave radio, our 3 children got up, and we all gathered in the living room, and military music filled the room as we turned on the shortwave. And the announcement was from Colonel Ikea Chempong, and he said he had taken over the country, it was Operation Feed Yourself, and foreigners should leave. We're 200 miles inland, and I begin to wonder how would the events of this night, change our lives. And to start with, we probably should go clear back to 1963, and that's when we finished college, and we had a 3-month-old, and we were pastoring a church in Northern California. My husband was like the intern and youth pastor, and we were starting a church over in Sonoma. And we ran the Pathfinders. We had 100 Pathfinders. We were really busy. And we received an invitation to go to Africa. And we were like, psychologically, are we ready to live in a mud house with thatched roofs and, all that kind of thing? Was my husband going to change to, clodhopper shoes and baggy socks and a pith helmet? And I wasn't prepared to pull my hair back in a bun and wear a long muslin dress. This just wasn't what we wanted to do. We were happy, we were doing what we wanted to do, and we asked the Lord, what should we do? And like I said, I'm just going to move from place to place here, but I can tell you that we made the decision to go, and I'll refer back to it again later, but what you read in books is not always the way it is. And we looked in books about Africa, and we were prepared. If God really wanted us to go, we would live in that mud hut. We would. And we knew that, things weren't going to be like we were used to, and there probably would be no electricity, and there probably would be no running water, and what would we do? Well, I'll tell you later how we decided to go, but we did go. And at the end, by the time of the coup, we had been there 8 years. We'd been 6 years in Liberia and 2 years in Ghana. And so we were kind of prepared, but nothing really prepares you when soldiers take over a country, when there is no more freedom, when you walk into town and the shopkeepers tell you what was $1 the day before, and I'm translating the money, $10 today, or some of it's just hidden. There's just nothing available because they're hoping to sell it for more the next day. And we also knew that we had seen the soldiers on campus. We had been told to stay in our house that day. We also knew that when we went to town a couple days later that there were buses coming into the markets and picking up the women from Nigeria and from other countries and taking them away. We were in Ghana at the time, Ghana, West Africa. And we were just like, what are we doing here? And I can share with you, however, that many of the lessons that I have learned about living, many of the lessons that I learned about God, I really learned from living in Ghana, West Africa. Ghana is a country that is actually the Hebrews that went down from Ethiopia from the Israelites that went down into Ethiopia, intermarried with nomadic tribes. They came across the Sudanic Strait. They came down into the forest land of West Africa, and after fighting with the Berbers, and they set up their families. And the particular group where we lived believed in God. They believed the day of worship was Sabbath. The name is Miminidah in their language, which means the day of the I Am, from Menominee. They kept a lot of the jubilees, a lot of the holidays, and we learned a lot about God. And their faith was so strong in an ever-present God. And I think that probably at this point I would like to stop and share with you that what I want to share with you tonight is God's story, Jesus' story, rather than mine. And so I would share it with the hope that you will see the love of Jesus even in tragedy. Let's bow our heads. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the song this evening, the reminder that you have a heavenly home that's waiting for each one of us. We thank you that you are giving us peace of mind here if we keep our minds stayed on you. Send the Holy Spirit in extra measure that the words that I speak are yours, for I ask it in your name. Amen. By the time of the coup, we had been in West Africa for 15 years. And we had prayed that we would be in the right place. Each time we made a move, we were in Liberia 6 years, Ghana 4, Sierra Leone a year and a half, back to Ghana for a year, but we never made a move without putting out the test. Is this what God wants us to do? And so I thought back as we dealt with this coup to the time when we were young people working at the church in Napa, California. And we had prayed that our decisions would be directed by God. If you read Psalms 119, verse 105, it says, "The word is our light. It will show us the path." And we accepted the counsel in 2 Chronicles 20:20 that we should believe the prophets, and we did believe. And we read Ellen White, we read the Bible, we knew that God calls people to work in other countries, and we felt comfortable. But we decided to put out the fleece. If you've read the story of Gideon and his 300, if not, please look it up. And we decided to put out the fleece. And these are the steps that helped us when we went through later times to look back and say, God brought us here where we are. And Philippians 1:6 says that the good work the Lord has started, he will finish. And so we decided, okay, let's put out the fleece. And the first one was that we had a newborn, and she was jaundice. The doctor had to clear that. And we were anxious, as all new parents are. And then we had just bought a new Valiant. It was a lot better than the French Simca we'd been driving that used to stop and I'd have to push and, try to get it going. And also we had just moved to a new home because we had a newborn and we had the church. So if God really wanted us to go, we had to sell the car, we had to have our daughter cleared for medical, and the apartment where we were staying, the manager had to say that we were out of our lease. And sure enough, my daughter was cleared. And then someone knocked on the door and said, I understand you might be leaving. And I just loved that car. It was a white Valiant with red interior. We're young and it was exciting. And he said, I'd really like to buy it. And we hadn't even decided we were going. And so we said, okay, if we go, Gary Land, some of you may know him, he bought the car. And then the apartment manager said that she would release us from our hold. And so we said, okay, but remember Charles Teal and Larry Garrity. Some of you may know them. Well, we went to school together. And Charles' wife, Marta, is a good friend of mine. And Marta Pastor came to Pacific Union College and could not speak English. She spoke Spanish, and Charles Teal was always giving her a bad time. He was always teasing her, and we just said, Marta, you need to stay away from him. Well, one night, Larry was in the bathroom between the two rooms in the dorm, and he heard Charles pray this prayer. Lord, if I'm supposed to ask Marta to marry me, I'm going to put this washcloth by my bed. And if the washcloth is dry and the carpet is wet, the next night I'm going to put the washcloth again. And if the washcloth is wet and the carpet is dry, the next day I'm going to ask Marta to marry me. And sure enough, while Charles was sleeping, Larry got up and poured the water. And the next night he got up and he poured the water again and on the cloth. And the next day, Charles asked Marta to marry him. And you know they've been married and happily married since the mid-60s. So I don't know. So I don't know if I trust Fleece or not because of Charles and Marta. So we said, okay, but what is our duty, you know? And we decided, Ellen White says, you know, that the voice of duty is to us like the voice of God. And so we were both students of the Bible, and we accepted the promises of the Bible. We accepted the promises, including where it says God will instruct us and He will be with you. And in fact, I found out later, having to do with marriage, and I'm glad I didn't know until after my husband and I were married. Anyway, bottom line is, after we were married, he told me that he was dating 3 girls, and I was one of them. That's interesting. And then he said he went to the chapel in the men's dorm, and he knelt down and he said, Lord, I can't keep doing this, so you're going to have to tell me which one to ask next, and then that's the one I'm going to marry. And he says that he heard my name. I've never heard the audible voice of God, and I'm glad I didn't know before we got married. So anyway, but he actually believed in that. And God's voice does come to us in different ways. And I also believe in counselors, talking to people who have more expertise than we do. And some of you will recognize these as the 7 steps for making decisions. And we followed them. And since we did, we knew that we were where God wanted us to be, and we survived the coup. I don't want to do too much explaining because my husband was a pastor and a Bible teacher at the academy, but it's because the colonel who took over the country decided if you worked for the brewery, you didn't have to leave. And so the brewery workers were allowed to stay, and I worked for the brewery. Now, just so you understand, our family was in a city 25 miles from our home, and a young couple from the States walked up to me and they said, you look like a Christian. Could you tell us how to cleanse our bodies? We're going back to the U.S., and we know that there should be some healthful way, you know, to cleanse our bodies. And I was like, well, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a nurse, I'm a teacher. And the lady looked up and she said, a teacher, do you teach elementary school? And at that time, the degree I had was in elementary ed. And I said, well, yes. And she said, well, look, I'm a kindergarten teacher for the workers for the brewery, and I'm leaving on vacation. Could you take my class for me? And I said, well, on one condition, and that is that my children can also attend the school because I would bring them with me. And there have been a lot of incidents at the elementary school, and I don't need to go into those. And I just knew we had to move, but we didn't know how to move our children from the Adventist training school that had been taken over by people appointed by the government, and they didn't want our children there, and it was really a terrible situation. We had been praying for a way to stay and a way for our children to be in a good school. So I went to work for the brewery, and my kids came with me. And because of that, we were not asked to leave. And we survived the coup. We survived the next 2 years of, there was a second coup actually after that. And we just knew our faith was affirmed. We were where God wanted us to be, and we were protected. Well, some years later, we were living in Sierra Leone, and I again faced the question, what are we doing here? It seems like God had to just keep talking to me because I had to be affirmed that I am where I'm supposed to be because of this stuff. Well, the students on that campus were rioting. In fact, the ladies and their children had come to our living room, and the men had all gone down to the cafeteria and to the girls' dorm because you could hear all the noise, and they were just destroying the buildings, and everyone was scared, and so they had come to our house. And my husband was gone, but the ladies and the children were in the living room, and I slipped into the kitchen. I looked out the window, and I saw a group of students with torches coming to burn the houses. They had intended, we found out later, to burn our homes. And ours was the first house on the row as you come from the cafeteria and the dorms. And so I thought, oh my goodness, I can't go in. I can't go in where these ladies and children are because I know that they'll know something's wrong. So I stayed in the kitchen, and I just squeezed my eyes shut, and I just stood in the window, and I just prayed and prayed. And when I opened my eyes, they had reached the corner of our yard, and they turned around and left. We found out later that someone in the group said, "We can't do that to the Brysons. We can't do that." And they had turned around and left. And so all of these many experiences, in fact, we'd be here for several days if I told you so many experiences that we've had in our service there. But each time, I can tell you there were miracles. There were things that God did that only God could do. So I knew we were where we were supposed to be. In fact, one experience I should share with you is that I was the sponsor for the senior class, and the president of the country had a relative in our school. We were at an Adventist school, but it was called the Country Club School by most of the missionaries across the West Coast, because Liberia is very much like America, and we were 50 miles outside of the city, so the majority of our students were government workers' children. And we had relatives from people that were in the mansion, like the White House. And so President Tubman left a cable that he would like to speak to the sponsor of the senior class, because this student, unknown to me, Lomax Tubman, had asked his relative, his great uncle or whatever, President William Buchanan Shadrach Tubman, to be our guest speaker for graduation. So I'm like, okay. No one wanted to go with me to the mansion to answer this cable that had said the sponsor needs to come to the mansion at such and such a time. Well, I finally took a young lady with me whose father was deputy chief of protocol, and we went to the mansion, and we waited and waited, all these dignitaries coming and going, and then it was our turn, and we walked in to see the president, and he told us that he had been invited to be our guest speaker, but that he couldn't because there were 40 delegates from the Congo. And I said, well, we can provide provision for the 40 delegates. I mean, I'm 22 years old. What do I know? We're going to entertain, 40 delegates from the Congo. And so he said he just couldn't. In fact, he actually stopped at one point, because I can be very persuasive, and he sang a song, "Forgive the repentant sinner and let him live." And I realized that I was pushing a little too far. So he did send his son, a senior senator. He sent his daughter, and he sent the vice president's daughter, and the limos all came, and we had a huge graduation. But then I got another cable. Please come back to see the president. And my husband wouldn't go with me. The president of the mission wouldn't go with me. Everybody was like, what are you doing in the mansion, And so I went, and I waited a long time. And when I was called, he said that he would like to give a dinner for the senior class, and I asked him, well, can we include all the faculty and the mission officers, because I could see that was going to be needed. And he said yes, and he said the date, and somehow it hit. I said, you know what, I really don't think that date will work. And he said, it must be a Sabbath. And I said, probably. And he said, you Adventists, you would die for the Sabbath. And he told me a story about some earlier missionaries who had lived in the country in Lower Buchanan, not out of the capital city, and how he had been on a cruise ship, and as the ship, yeah, you can relate to this. He was on a trip, and he was arrived in Lower Buchanan, and all of the school children had been practicing. Our children had worn the Pathfinder uniforms, and they were going to be on the port and welcome the president. And day after day they were ready, and he never came. Ships don't always come on time. I imagine, Brother Butcher, that yours do, but anyway, the day came, and it was Sabbath. And the soldiers came to the church and said, it's time for your young people to go, to the port. We're just letting everyone know and going to the schools and everything. And Elder C.D. Henry, the missionary at the time, he said, it's our Sabbath, and we're in church, and you will have to talk to each of the students themselves. And so each of the young people were called out, and each one said no, they would not go, and they were all put in prison. One by one, they were put on the back of a truck and taken to this jail. Now, I've seen that jail, and it's just like a cement block room with bars in the front, and this was Sabbath morning. And President Tubman is telling me the story, and then he put his hands out, and he said, do you know that your pastor couldn't get in to see me on Sunday or Monday or Tuesday? He couldn't get in till Wednesday. And he said, maybe that's the reason, but he said, your pastor had a Bible and his hands were shaking so much that I took the Bible away from him and turned to Exodus and gave him a study on the Sabbath. And he says, I understood exactly. And he said, if he were not president of the country, he probably would have been a Seventh-day Adventist. That was such, it was just thrilling to talk with him and just one-on-one and hear the president. A lot more was talked about. But you know, I've walked barefoot in funerals. I've walked through rivers with crocodiles. I've walked across rope bridges, reaching people in need. I've told my story around the campfire at the Muslim funerals. A Muslim funeral, sometimes they have a Christian section, an animist section, and a Muslim section. In fact, one night I went to one that was simply Muslim, and I got kicked out about 2 a.m. because they read the Quran the entire night on the 7th day of the travel of the body, and you can't do anything to disrupt that journey. And so I got hit with a stick, and then I went to sleep again, probably around 2 or 3 a.m, and I got asked to leave. So I had to find a hut with a door and, just go in and wait till the morning. But I've had those experiences with joy, with you're fearful sometimes, but you know that God is with you. You know God is taking you to this place and that you've touched people's lives. And many of your church members go on mission trips, so I don't need to tell you all the kinds of things that can happen and the blessings that can happen. And I know I met Lorraine Hansen on a mission trip to Jamaica. We built dormitories, and then we worked in Dominican, and then we met again in India. And some of us who go on these trips from different parts of the U.S. have been friends for a long time, and I've appreciated that. But I can tell you that a lot of things changed for me after that, and I just need to have it with me so that I can tell it properly. I was in Sierra Leone, and there it was a little different than some of the other places where we had lived, and we had very little electricity, so I used a wooden mortar and a pestle and buckets of water and that kind of thing. And it's the only place where I did homeschool. My children went to the local schools in the other places, Ghana and Liberia. But here I was doing homeschool. But that morning that I'm going to share with you, my children all woke up with a desire to find the cat that lived in our cafeteria on campus because she was pregnant and she was going to have her kittens. And we just knew the kittens were going to be born that day. So I said, fine, I'll clean up. You go see if you can find, JC. That was her nickname. And so the children went out to find the cat, and I was on the back porch, and I was washing the wooden mortar and the pestle, and I saw the cat coming, and her tongue was hanging out, and I knew she'd had her kittens. So I turned to go in the house to get a bowl of water for her, and some students yelled at me, look out, look out. And I turned around and she was lunging at me, and I grabbed the pestle and I threw it at her, and she ran into the bush, into the forest behind our house, and I went immediately to find the science teacher because he kept the animals, the civet cats and the crocodiles from the river and all that kind of stuff. He would know what to do. But his wife was also the school nurse. And so when I got to the house, there were 5 people in their home, and they'd all been bitten by this cat. And my daughter was there, and so she had taken the kittens and put them in her dress and was trying to take them to our house when the mother cat grabbed her arm and wouldn't let go. And one of the students actually knocked the cat off and took her, to the nurse. But we didn't realize at the moment, but we were getting pretty sure, and the cat had rabies. And so the 5 people were taken about 20 miles, which takes about 2 hours, to the nearest hospital, and they only had medicine for 1 person. And it was a rat brain base, and I'm not a medical person, so I don't know all the terms, But what I do know is that they divided it among the 5 of them, and then we went up to the Adventist hospital, Masanga, a leprosarium, and they ordered duck embryo from Holland. And my daughter was really allergic to that first medicine, and so when the duck embryo came, we were really happy. But as it turned out, the duck embryo coming from Holland for about 5 years had been contaminated and was contaminated, and some people actually died. But my daughter got encephalitis, but we didn't know what it was, and it was very difficult for us. But we had lived in Ghana for 4 years, and we knew the hospital care was excellent. And so rather than to go back to the States, we talked to the American Embassy, and they said it was okay, and we moved. We moved to Ghana. And this time, my husband was president of the North Ghana Conference, and we had gone to these really good hospitals, and there was another coup. Some soldiers took over the country, medicine was scarce. I was actually teaching at a government school in Tamale, but we thought, well, we can make it, because we had gone around and greeted our neighbors. Here in America, when you move into a neighborhood, people usually come and, let you unpack, and then they'll come and say welcome and give you a loaf of bread or something. Well, in West Africa, as far as the countries I've lived, what happens is you don't unpack anything. As soon as you arrive, you go and tell your neighbors, I'm here. And it's a way of saying, introducing yourself and saying you're here, and then they come back and welcome you. So I had gone to our neighbors and told them that we were the new family living on this property and so on. And almost all of our neighbors were Muslim, and it was Ramadan. So I greeted them on the Ramadan. And when the coup took place a few months later, those neighbors are the ones who came to my house and gave me something called a chit. It's like your cards for tonight's gifts, and they own shops. And so instead of the coup being like it was when we had been there years before, now this coup, we actually could go with the chit, and I could get 100 pounds of flour, I could get a 100-pound bag of rice, I could get these goods, because these Muslim shopkeepers came back and welcomed us to the community, because we reached out to them, to the community. And so they were our friends. In fact, when my daughter's illness became so severe and the doctors told me I needed to take her back to the States, it was actually the son of the Muslim civil chief, not the civil chief, the cultural chief, who came and asked if the elders from the mosque could come and pray for her. And I said, probably not. My husband is traveling, and it's an Adventist church, but I would be willing to let one person come. And so he taught me how to kneel on the mat as a non-Muslim, as a woman, and he prayed for my daughter. And so it was really, really moving for me, and I still believe. I believed and I trusted where God wants us to be. Excuse me, and it's going to work out. And I arrived back in the U.S. I actually came back with my daughter. I flew. In fact, that's very interesting, because I flew first into New York, okay? And I arrived in New York, and some of you will remember, in fact, there's a recent documentary on the Jim Jones situation in Guyana. So I have a daughter who's very ill. I've overdosed on her medicine so that she will be quieter on the plane, but she's waking up and it's really not good, and I'm getting off the plane, and they said, the airport people are like, can I help you? Can I help you? And I said, well, my daughter's very sick. We just came from Ghana. Oh my goodness. We got taken over to I don't know if you know, there were about 30 survivors of the Jim Jones Guyana thing. So they thought I said Guyana, not Ghana. So they were taking me over, and I saw these people, I saw the soldiers and the rifle, and I said, we're from Ghana, Ghana, West Africa. And later this would be significant to me, and I will share that with you in a moment. So that was my entrance to the U.S., and then I went to Washington, D.C., and the National Children's Hospital did tests, and they told us that she would never get well. She was 15, and she had spent her entire life in West Africa, mission service with us, and so the rest of the family had to return to the U.S. So my son came first on his 10th birthday, actually, and then my husband and daughter, second daughter, came later after they had taken care of all the business and joined us. But it was really difficult for us. And she was in a hospital, and I know it's written here, but never mind. She was in the hospital in Worthington, Ohio for a test following the results of the test in Washington, D.C. And they told me that they didn't believe she would get well either. And the doctor who owns the hospital in Ohio is a family friend of my mother's family. And so he told me that he was going to make sure that we were not troubled for the rest of our life, that this young lady would go to a hospital and be there, and just whatever had to be done would be done, and she would shuffle along, and I could go on with my life. And he didn't realize I'm a mother. I'm a mother. I'm sorry. So I waited till a day when he was gone, because he traveled quite a bit. His sister was in California, and his brother was a little more, workable. So I waited till he was on duty, and I went in and signed her against medical advice and took her out and went to a wilderness survival program in Northern California. Now, but remember, I'm praying, I'm looking at everything that I should do, and I'm believing I'm where I'm supposed to be, and this is what I'm supposed to do. But it was starting to wear on me, all of these things. And I don't know if for you, but when I'm going through a really tragic time, in a difficult time, I don't spend as much time reading. The reading has to be before. But when you're going through that, you just don't feel like reading. But at this time, I just didn't know what to do. And I had things exactly planned, but it didn't work out. And there were 3 days before I could get the flight from Ohio to California. And anyway, I think the time is running out, so I'm going to let that go. But I can just tell you that someday I'm going to write a book about the last name in the phone book. And maybe I should tell you, those 3 days that she was home, and I'm not a doctor and I didn't know what to do, she would go out the front door and disappear. And I wouldn't know where she was. And I would go looking for her. I found her one time on the sidewalk in Columbus, and just, different things. And the third day, and I don't know what I'm going to do. And I got a phone call from a man by the name of George Zizoff. Z-Y-Z, okay, Zizoff. And he said, we have your daughter. And he told me that he and his brother inherited a lot of money from their parents. And they decided to set up a house in Columbus, knowing that people in trouble would call the last name in the phone book. And they took care of people who would call the last name in the phone book, and they did this for many, many years. And I actually had the opportunity to meet them later. But at this time, he called me, and he brought my daughter home. And long story, we made it to California. But the wilderness approach that I tried in California was started by my husband's roommate and a psychiatrist. He had taken training from the military, and he had taken training from one of our self-supporting medical units that had taught a lot about the natural methods and natural healings. And being in Africa, I used a lot of natural stuff myself. I knew how to use the Odusini medicines and so on. And so I was comfortable with this approach. And so when he called me in Worthington and said, would you like to come? I said, okay, but what is it like? And because when I got back to the States and the National Children's Hospital said that my daughter would not get well, I had called a number of the self-supporting programs and said, can I come? Can I bring my daughter? And they said no. And so I was a little surprised that this program was starting, but there was one condition. A parent had to come with the teenager. So it wasn't a program just for teens. It was a program, but you had to come. And so I said, you know what? I'm going to do it. I'm going to. So I took my 10-year-old son. My second daughter stayed with some friends and continued school, and I managed somehow. My son, my daughter, and I arrived in Northern California. We bought 2 trailers, a classmate of mine from high school helped me move them out onto this 20 acres, 8 miles from the nearest person, the nearest communication, no transportation, no communication. I went to an Army surplus store before, and I bought a lot of Black & Decker tools and put them in the, in the trailers, and I had a hose, and I put the hose up into a river so that I could get water into the, into the trailer. And we had a gangplank on the back where the mice would come along, to get the peanut butter and then land in the bucket because we just couldn't kill anything. And then my son would take the bucket across in the morning, across the creek, it was actually a creek, and let them go free. And, excuse me, and I took my daughter off of all medications, all psychotropic medications. No oil, no dairy products, no sugar. And once a week, a family from Feather Falls would come and bring some food. And the men came and cut down some trees, and they taught me how to chop firewood. So I chopped the firewood, and we had our wilderness experience there. And then my son, he's only 10, and he said, "Mom, I want to sleep outside by myself somewhere in the woods." And I'm like, oh dear. But he's 10, and he wants to be the man of the house. And so I said, okay. So he walked around during the day, found a place, and we put his food into one of these net bags to hang up in the tree, and he had his little radio to make noise. I told him, look, the noise will keep the animals away. And we have bears there, by the way, and snakes, and a lot of things. But I'd grown up in Northern California, and I went camping, and I was a master guide, and so I figured he can handle it. Okay. Until he took me to see the place. And we went, he wasn't very far from the running water, so that was good. And his food was put away well, and he had his sleeping bag. And I said goodnight, and everything seemed to be fine, but I somehow got lost on the way back to the trailer. And the path that I took, I came across a deer that had been killed by a bear because there were bear claws in the dirt. And I was like, oh dear. I wanted to go back and get him, but I didn't. And he stayed there overnight. Several months went by, and I felt that my daughter was ready to return to the community. And that's when I realized that I had gotten myself into something a little bit dangerous, because the doctor in charge said that we were not free to go, that there was another phase of this program. And I began to get a little nervous, and so I said, well, I want my son to go and stay with my brother-in-law. He's a professor in Oregon and the university up there, and I'd like him to take the bus, from Chico and go. And he said no, and he walked away. And I was there, 8 miles from the nearest town, no communication, no transportation, and I was getting these feelings like, I need to get out of here. And I knelt in the dirt by our trailers, and I said, Lord, you brought us here. You've got to take us out. I need my son to have transportation. And the next day, a young kid came on an ATV into our clearing. Wow. And so I put him on the back of the ATV, and I sent him. And this young man took him to the bus station and helped him reach, my brother-in-law, where he stayed. And the doctor wasn't very happy about it, and he came a few days later. And he came with a truck and 3 men, and he said he was going to take my daughter for phase 2. And I said, you're not taking my daughter without me. And they wrapped her in a sheet, and they put her in the back of the truck, and I jumped on the back of the truck, and I said, I'm going to. And so we went up to the top of Camel Mountain. It's about 3 miles from the top of Camel Mountain, and we started phase 2. And I'm telling you, I prayed, but things happened. My daughter's sleeping bag caught in the campfire, and she got 2nd and 3rd degree burns on both feet. And some timber lorry people evidently picked up on what was going on, and they had on the, shortwave or whatever, the cable, and the doctor's mother, working in Paradise, heard it on the band, the police band. And so she sent a truck to go and get her son, the doctor, and me, and my daughter, and I asked to be taken to the hospital, and they took us back to the woods and drove away. So now I'm 8 miles from transportation, 8 miles from any help, and my daughter's burns are really bad, both feet, they're just charred, and I can see the line coming up, and I can see the swelling, And again, I knelt on the ground, and I just said, Lord, you have to get us out of here. You just have to. And the next day, they came. The doctor must have had a change of heart, because he came back, and we took her to the hospital. And at the hospital, after the burns were healed, she should have come home, but the state of California said that I had made decisions involving cultish activities with the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and that they did not trust my judgment for my daughter's well-being, and so I lost custody of my daughter. And that day, in that hospital, seeing her taken down the hall and her face breaking as they took her away from me, that day I wasn't sure I would ever be able to trust God again. I believed, I trusted, and here I am without anything. I can't do anything. I said, what can I do? And the doctor said, well, get yourself an attorney. That's what he told me. And so I can share with you, though, that there were some friends from Alabama, actually. We'd known them at Andrews, and they knew, and they called me every day, and they read the Bible to me. I didn't want to hear it, but they read it to me anyway, and they would just call and just read and read. And I would like to share with you that God is listening. He is listening. I learned so much more about God, and I should have shared it along the way instead of all at once, but what I learned is that our interpretation of these Bible stories is not always the way it was. For instance, there's a book by Bailey that means a lot to me, and it's called Luke Through the Eyes of Poets and Peasants, and it's written from the Bedouin background. And that experience is what I want to share just briefly with you. We read the Midnight Visitor, where there's the family that's baked bread for the day, and they've gone to sleep, and they're telling, the New Testament tells the story of how the midnight visitors come, and you have to wake up this man, and he steps over his sleeping family, and there's all kinds of stories that have been creative nonfiction stories about this story. And pastors usually tell that story, and it was told to me, you have to keep praying. You just have to keep praying. Well, prayer wasn't working. What do you mean I have to just keep praying? I've been praying. And then I heard this sermon about how you have to keep praying, like the woman that went to the king and like the midnight visitor. But this book, written by this man who lived with the Bedouins, this is what he said the story is really about. People travel at night. And when they travel at night, it's because it's cooler. In the desert, it's very hot. So the Bedouins travel at night, and visitors arrive in the night. Each section of a town is divided around an oven, okay? And there are certain families each day that are assigned to bake. And so the family that bakes in that region, or that section, or that area, is responsible to be lightly sleeping, preferably awake, so when visitors come, they can provide the bread. Now we say bread. Why bread? Because the bread was their knife, fork, and spoon. So when you baked for your family, that piece of bread was what you used for, gathering your food. And there are rules on how to use it, and you save it from day to day. So a visitor arriving is not going to have your child's half-eaten bread or your half-eaten bread. They need new bread. And so the family that bakes is responsible to provide the bread for the visitors that come on that given night. So the man is not sleeping heavily at all. He's listening because he doesn't want to be shamed. He doesn't want to lose the honor. He wants to know that his family has provided the bread as required. And so think about it in a different way. It's not how many times you come to God. It's not begging and begging. God knows. He's listening. He's listening for us, just like the man who is listening for for visitors. And I thought, okay, but then where is he? And so that meant a lot to me. Another story that I'll share with you in closing is the story of the woman of Shunem from 2 Kings chapter 4. You know, she talks a lot about, the text is 2 Kings chapter 4, and it's the woman of Shunem who builds the house on top, for the room on top of her house. She has her husband build it for the prophet. And I like that story because I thought, well, kindness does come back. And tomorrow I'll tell you some stories about how kindness comes back. But this story began to mean something more. If you can imagine, this woman was given a gift of a son, and when he's about 10, he's out working with his father, and he becomes very ill. And if you can picture that mother, and that's why it means something to me, because I was holding my daughter. She held her son and felt his breath go out of him. She felt her son cease to live. And in her culture, if she had said, he's dead, he would have been dead. Because they wouldn't have said anything else. He died, he's dead, the mourners would have come, there would have been wailing, and her son would have been dead. She took that son who had died in her lap and carried him up to the bed in the prophet's room and told her husband, "It shall be well. It shall be well." And her faith, as we know, was rewarded because she kept saying, "It will be well. It shall be well." She said it to Gehazi. She said it to the prophet. And I think it helped me then to start saying, okay, it will be well. It will be well. But still, I started thinking about all these other people who had lived in Africa, all the missionaries, all the people that I, some of them weren't very nice, like the man that was so mean that they caused a riot at our school. There are a lot of missionaries that they're there because they didn't get along here at home. I know, I can tell you of people who embezzled and were sent to mission field. People who commit adultery get sent to the mission field. People who get locked out of their classrooms and can't manage their schools, they get sent to the mission field. I've worked with them. And then there are people who go because they want to come back to the U.S. and hold a big position in the church. And particularly at that time, we were under Northern Europe, and you had to work 2 years in West Africa before you could serve the church in the Northern European countries. So people came for those reasons. Our family, we felt, went to be neighbors there as neighbors are there. In fact, remember the clodhopper shoes and the muslin dress? I took my spike heels. I took my hat. I took my gloves. I took my nylon stockings. I went there and was who I am there as I am here. And we loved it there. But all of these people that seemed to do things that weren't right, they were prospering. Their kids did well. Their children did well. But we had all this trouble. What's going on? And then Psalm 73. Here is Asaph. He's one of the leaders of the music for David's kingdom. And he says, truly is God good to Israel. Truly God is good to Israel. And then he says, but there's so many people that are doing wrong, and only good things happen to them. He says, I'm keeping your law. I'm doing what's right. Why are these ungodly people prospering? And it's, for those of you who know, it's a chiastic chapter, and the message is right in the middle. And he says, this is too painful for me. And the next verse, which is verse 17, until I went into the sanctuary of God, and then I understood their end. You and I, even the song tonight could not have been better, know that Jesus is coming. There's a better world. We can have peace of mind. We can say, it shall be well. And we know that it shall be well because God is. And because there is a world when we will no longer ask why. We will know that God had a plan and that we're part of that plan. So remember, try to think positive. It was very hard for me, but every once in a while I have to remind myself, it shall be well. It shall be well. And I wish that for each one of you, you can remember that Jesus loves you and he is coming again. It shall be well.